Hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, kind of depending on your time zone. We're here today to talk about a couple operational challenges that you might have with implementing PCI DSS requirements 6.4.3 and 11.6.1, and we'll go ahead and get started. I'll introduce everybody here, starting with John Elliott, who is a security advisor here at Jscrambler. Before Jscrambler, he was part of one of MasterCard's representatives to the Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council, where he helped to develop version 4 of the PCI DSS. He's also worked at Visa Europe in a similar role and implemented PCI DSS at large companies, consults various groups on PCI related things, and was once a QSA himself. And then also joined by Gareth Bowker, who is a PCI technical advisor to Jscrambler, and has worked in the payment card industry for over 18 years, starting out as a QSA, then as a PA QSA, a card production assessor, and then worked for 12 years at the council directly as a trainer, then as director of training, and finally responsible for the council's information security and their own PCI compliance. Like John, is a member of the technical working group updating PCI DSS and has been a part of the P2PE working group. And then myself, I am here at Jscrambler as the Director of Sales Engineering, fill in a couple of technical roles, showing clients our solutions, helping them find the best ways to solve various security related matters. And of course, today we're talking about PCI specifically. Couple housekeeping items. We're going to try and stick to about 60 minutes today. We'll have a couple polls for you to answer. They'll pop up in the center of the screen. You can pick an answer from there, and perhaps we'll chat about those answers, some of those, just to see where people are at, how far along you are in a particular journey or implementing these requirements. Do post your questions either in chat, or there is also a dedicated questions area. As we go through a couple of the items, couple of the topics today, we'll either pick some of those out if they apply directly, or we'll answer the rest of those at the end in a Q&A session. I'm mostly going to be talking kind of more of a roundtable format about a couple different topics that you might want to consider, and you will get an email with a recording of this webinar sometime after the event wraps up. As far as Jscrambler goes, why are we here talking on this particular topic? We were founded in 2010, mostly focusing on protecting JavaScript. If you've read the 2 requirements here recently, you'll note that they have a lot to do with JavaScript and client-side security. And that's where we kind of started off in a couple of different products. First with code integrity, focusing on the protection of JavaScript that your organization might be developing. And lately with web page integrity, I say lately, but in the past 5 years, developing web page integrity to protect your application, data that rests in that application, from abuses, skimming, other types of attacks that can be conducted against web applications, and then also seeing how that applies to PCI DSS version 4. We've also recently gone through our second assessment against PCI DSS version 4 to help our clients better. To start out, Gareth is going to walk us through reading the requirements and a couple other nuances that apply to how a QSA might be looking to test for those requirements, which suggest some things that you might want to have handy. I'm going to give us kind of a brief overview of some implementation methods. We'll get into the bulk of the operational challenges, and then at the end I'll talk a little bit more about the time that you have left and how you might use that time, and then we'll cover any other questions that we haven't answered along the way. So Gareth, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Okay, I just wanted to highlight a few things here about the requirements that we're talking about. Obviously, requirement 6.4.3 and 11.6.1. I'm not going to read the requirements, don't worry. I'm sure you're all fairly familiar with the requirements themselves. They're taken straight out of PCI DSS here, but I did want to highlight a few things. So you can see the defined approach up at the top here. That's one way to meet this requirement, and it's probably what almost everybody watching this will be doing. But it's worth also looking at what the customized approach says. This is where each requirement's intent, the objective of that requirement is defined. So often if something doesn't make complete sense as you're reading the defined approach in terms of what you need to do, the customized approach can give you some additional clues too. And then the other area to look is the testing procedures on the right-hand side here. So whether you're doing a full report on compliance with a QSA or an ISA, or you're doing a self-assessment questionnaire, it's worth looking at the testing procedures in detail. These are the instructions that the QSA or the ISA will follow as they're conducting an assessment. So they shouldn't be asking you to do any more than what's written on here, or any less for that matter. We get a lot of questions, and I've had questions for 10, 15 years plus now about exactly what evidence is needed as people are going through an assessment. And provided you're doing the defined approach, it's these testing procedures here that define exactly what it is you'll need. So in 6.4.3a here, you'll see that you need to demonstrate relevant policies and procedures for payment page scripts. So you'll need all of those documented somewhere. In the next testing procedure, the assessor will be interviewing the relevant people to make sure that they're aware of and following those policies and procedures too. And finally here, you'll need some evidence, so system configurations, inventory records, that show that you've implemented those settings correctly. Everything needs to tie up nicely, and then you shouldn't have any problem with that requirement. If you're doing a self-assessment questionnaire here as well, the testing procedures called something slightly different in the SAQs. They're called expected testing, but the intent is basically the same. It just uses simplified language in those expected testing requirements. So again, if you're ever unsure what's expected of you when you're completing an SAQ, you can download a full copy of the PCI DSS version 4 from the document library on PCIsecuritystandards.org. And then for 11.6.1, it's basically the same thing. Again, I'm not going to read this, but you can see the intent of the requirement there, the objective of the requirement at the bottom. And for the testing procedures here, for point A, you can see that the assessor, they'll want to look at your system settings. So looking at the web pages themselves as well, and seeing the results from your monitoring. So you need to be able to know exactly where each of those pieces are. For point B, it's checking that the change and the tamper detection mechanisms is configured as it should be. Again, everything tying together nicely. Again, you want to make sure these are defined somewhere. For point C, this only applies if your mechanism is being performed on a custom time frame. In this case, you'll be doing a targeted risk assessment or a TRA. And here the assessor is just checking to make sure that you follow the correct process for that TRA. And then finally, for point D, the assessor is checking that your detection mechanisms are actually being performed at the defined frequency, so whatever that is. So again, here what we're doing is simply demonstrating that everything is working, everything is defined properly, everything's working correctly, and that you have the evidence to demonstrate to the assessor. That's it. That's all you're going to need for these requirements. It can feel quite daunting as you're looking at the requirements and trying to figure out what you need, but really everything is defined very, very clearly in the testing procedures in terms of what you'll need. So just focus on implementing the requirements, collecting the evidence that's defined there in the testing procedures, and you won't go far wrong. Back to you, Jeffrey.
Appreciate it. Yeah, and what we found is that, while it could be possible to meet a lot of these requirements purely manually without any type of tooling, typically the kind of technical side of these requirements is handled by three broad categories. Either content security policy and sub-resource integrity, where you're using CSP to control who is allowed to load script into the page, SRI to look for exact versions of that script. Something that either falls into the agentless or synthetic user monitoring category, where we're taking a solution might take a web page, load that page into either a headless browser or some other system to examine that page, see who loads into that page, look at the headers to monitor there, or an agent that is actually running in the end client's browser that can read everything that's going on in there for generating that information for compliance. Now, of course, these three can come from a different group of from different entities, right? Your CDN may offer some of these solutions. You may have services that offer just scanning. You might have someone like ourselves, Jscrambler, where we actually fall into two of these categories, right? And we'll talk about these as we go through. And so these can come from a variety of different sources. Any one or a combination can get you to compliance, but there are other things to consider outside of a technical solution. And that's the parts that we really want to discuss today. And so we've got a couple different topics that, whether you've already picked out a solution and are looking to kind of build the processes and policies around that solution to support that and to have that evidence available for a QSA or for an SAQ, want to help you to consider some of those items, whether you're already picked a solution or about to. And that kind of brings us to the first challenge. And this is around managing or controlling who adds scripts or who has that ability. So I've got a couple different topics here. John, I'll let you start out, right? Talking about stakeholders, how many scripts are there, first, third party.
Yeah, sure. It's an interesting challenge and varies from organization to organization, well, almost depending how large and complex your website is. And the way I would and don't do this. Like, I'm going to give you an example, but I think something not to do. You know, what you need to do is find out effectively who's responsible for having JavaScript on the website, and it's typically one of 3 or 4 different areas. It might be the development team who added some JavaScript to the website, or it could be the people who maintain the website using some sort of content management system who do it, or it could be the marketing department or the digital department. So those are typically the 3 areas who can add JavaScript to the website. And what you need to do is find out who owns each piece of JavaScript. Now, the thing I would like to tell you to do is to turn all the pieces of JavaScript off and see who runs and shouts at you. Of course, we're not going to do that, but what we want to do is find the business owner, the person from a business perspective that said we need that piece of JavaScript. So the easiest thing is to get an inventory and then go around the organization saying who owns this, who owns this, who owns this, and start with development. What you'll find is there are 2 sorts of scripts. First-party scripts that are served from your own domain, so scripts that you own, and then third-party scripts that are served from places all over the internet. So, and you might find that people who own first-party scripts are typically the development team, and maybe the content management people, if they're using a content management system like Ghost or WordPress or any of the much larger content management systems, they may add, without even noticing they're adding a script, they might add some functionality to the website. They might think, oh, I'd like a carousel of images, and they drag the carousel tool onto the website, but that carousel tool actually just drops some more JavaScript on the website. Or it could also be from the marketing department who've got user tracking, advertising, and things like that. And that would typically be, again, third-party script that's coming from somewhere else. And then what undoubtedly most of you will come across is something called a tag manager. And a tag manager was designed, and it's got this really nice name. Tag manager sounds like a fun thing, doesn't it? But it was designed to let people who weren't technological put JavaScript onto the website, because most advertising and tracking and retargeting and marketing software, marketing systems use a piece of JavaScript to send some information about the browser session to somewhere else. Those things are typically put there by the marketing teams. Now, if they had to go to the developers every time saying, oh, can you put this piece of JavaScript on the website? Can you take this one off now? Can you put this one on? It would never happen. And so what Google came up with, and other companies like Adobe and Insight do this, is they put a little stub of JavaScript on the website. And then because that little stub is there, it's called a tag manager. It then allows the marketing department to use a graphic user interface that says when this little stub of JavaScript loads lots of other JavaScript. So you'll often find when you get your inventory or do an inventory that a lot of the script is being pulled in by the tag manager. So that's first party and third party. And then you'll find some third party scripts are actually pulling scripts from other places, so fourth and fifth and subsequent party scripts. But the key thing is to find who from a business perspective, who's the stakeholder who actually wants that JavaScript on the website. Because you have to remember, and the reason the standard has got these new requirements is every piece of JavaScript is potentially a piece of attack surface that if a malicious criminal or a malicious actor could get criminal or malicious JavaScript into their good JavaScript, it could affect the security of your website.
And I think a good point, Gareth, that you brought up earlier too. Part of this is understanding who can add it, but also how much do you have, right? And that might impact what solution you want to go with. And Gareth, I don't know if you want to express what kind of where you were talking about. You're considering the total amount versus how often they change, or whether it's first party.
Sure. So yeah, when we were talking about the three different methods of meeting these requirements, or with CSP through agentless to using an agent, I think for a lot of companies where the website isn't changing very often and it's a relatively straightforward website, and that JavaScript is essentially just first-party JavaScript, CSP and SRI is probably all you need. The difficulty comes once things get more complicated. So as that gets more complicated, the amount of time it's taking for people to manage this becomes higher. The complexity of managing CSP and SRI, and particularly with third party with SRI, that can potentially cause your site to break. That the complexity goes up, and then similarly, the agentless or the synthetic user monitoring, that is relatively straightforward, again, if your site isn't changing very often. But from a security perspective, the risk there is if the site is changing very regularly, you may miss changes. So if your site is changing, every day or several times a day, and you're only doing a scan once every week, you don't know what's happening in that interim. And for those types of scenarios, having an agent running in the code in the website and in the browser makes a lot of sense. It will detect any changes as they happen and can look at what's going on and so on and monitor it. So like I say, depending on how complex your site is, how much it's changing, and the types of first party versus third party code that you have, that can have a big impact on which type of solution you want to choose. And John, I saw you put your hand up there for a second.
Yeah, because you said something very important, Gareth, and really I wanted to get to sort of almost the reason why the requirements are written the way they are. Because if you look at the requirements, it's like have an inventory, have some justification of why it's necessary, have someone authorize it. This is in the nicest possible way, sort of compliance busy work, like it's making people do compliance things. And that was a deliberate idea. The idea wasn't that people should go out and buy a tool. It was that if you could reduce the amount of JavaScript on your website, and hopefully making an inventory and all this busy work will be an incentive to reduce the amount of JavaScript on the website, that you can actually manage it using free tools like content security policy. Maybe not SRI. I tend to use hashes in CSP because at least then you get an error message if something goes wrong. But the intention was for people to look at the attack surface and try and reduce the attack surface, not to keep a very large attack surface and buy a tool to try and manage the big attack surface. I know that failed. I mean, I know that's not what people do, and I absolutely understand that. But it was also maybe to make people think about re-architecting their website so that when they move to the payment page, they can take out a lot of the JavaScript. A lot of compromises we saw in the past, 6 or 7 years before version 4 came out, a lot of compromises were down to compromised JavaScript, and people did not know that piece of JavaScript was on the payment page, and they did not know why it was on the payment page. So part of it was to build consciousness of that by managing and controlling exactly what you say, Jeffrey, managing and controlling who adds JavaScript to reduce the attack surface.
Yeah, and I think where we've seen these in kind of real examples is, kind of on the very light end, being someone like a payment provider, payment service provider that's giving even an embedded iframe might have that limited script, right? But where we've actually seen the most limited ones would be embedded fields, right? So you're using multiple iframes in the same page to collect each piece of the card data. That's where we've seen that, hey, I really have maybe one script, maybe even none script inside of those frames, and that might be that area where that becomes very practical, right? To not have some kind of tool in there. But then once we get out to kind of the opposite extreme is where we see kind of like B2C retail, hospitality, groups like that have tons of script, and then everyone else falling somewhere in between. But those are kind of the wide range of what we've seen recently with people trying to address this.
I think just one final thing I would add here as well on the tag manager side of it is that process that we talked about for authorization would also need to cover the tag manager changes that are being put in. So again, if marketing or whoever it is who's making changes to the tag manager, as they're adding scripts, removing scripts, changing functionality, that also comes under that same process. I mean, there may be two different processes, but they both need to be thought about and considered for these PCI requirements.
In fact, why don't we move on and discuss processes, Jeffrey?
Yeah, I think it's a good time. Yeah, and so that's the next challenge I've got. How many processes do you need, right? Do you need to handle, right? We talked about first third-party script, talked about different, maybe you have different products, maybe different experiences for clients, different ways to get to a checkout. So how many processes do you need?
4 is usually the right answer. You need a process when you want a new piece of first-party JavaScript on your website, and a process that you follow when you want to change that. And you might have that already if you've got a fairly mature organization with a good CI/CD pipeline. People might raise a ticket in Jira before they're going to add some new JavaScript to their website. They might even do a security evaluation of where that JavaScript is, or what it is, or where it's coming from. They might run it through some static or dynamic analysis. So often organizations we see have a really good process for new first-party JavaScript. But if that's a library, sometimes when the library updates and changes, they don't have such a robust process for changes to first-party JavaScript. But then for third-party JavaScript, it's actually really incredibly hard because it might be added by someone like the marketing department, so it might be added by lots of different people. And so you tend to need a process for new third-party JavaScript, and you might need different ones depending which stakeholder are adding it. And of course, when third parties change their JavaScript, they don't ring you up. There isn't a phone call from Google that says, it's Google here, we're changing the Google Maps JavaScript, can we have your authorization? I mean, that doesn't happen, right? So you're never going to get any notification of third-party changes. So you need to have a process that notices that the third-party JavaScript has changed, and then make sure that is an authorized change, and you can update your inventory. So as to your question, does authorization take place before or after? It depends. The standard's quite happy that authorization can happen afterwards. It says so in the guidance column. Typically, what we see in mature organizations is authorization before for first-party JavaScript and authorization after for third-party JavaScript is a broad generalization because you notice some new JavaScript's appeared. It's unauthorized, so 11.6.1 noticed it happened, and then you find a way of authorizing it.
Right.
On the other hand, I was going to say, on the other hand, if you're using content security policy with a very strict content security policy, then somebody has to come to you and say, I need to add this third-party JavaScript to the website, and the CSP needs to change. So you can do that way. And again, it depends, as Gareth was talking about to begin with, about how static your website is, how often or how frequently things change. I've seen websites with a tag manager in there, which might have 600 different tags coming in from different marketing and remarketing and advertising and targeting networks. That's going to change every day. Whereas I've seen other websites where they actually put the payment page on a separate website called payments. Whatever your website is called, and they made that and they tightened that down very highly to make sure they didn't have to do so much management of it.
Yeah, and I think we'll have a pretty good discussion around that. One of the later questions talking about
Okay.
single page applications too, right? Scoping and how do we reduce
Yeah.
things. But the tag manager is where I kind of wanted to go back to, right? You talk about having a pretty rigid change management policy for first party code, which might be the best case scenario, but
If you can.
likely, right, if you
Yeah,
can,
if you
right,
can.
as far as what's existing, but likely
Yeah.
even if you have that control process, the tag manager may exist outside of it, right?
Yeah.
Someone who has control or access to that tag manager could add something to the page that really is not going through change
Yep.
management unless you've got an explicit procedure for that.
Yeah. I mean, you could go and ask your marketing department to adhere to your internal CI/CD pipeline and change control process, or you could bang your head on a wall. It probably have exactly the same effect. So
Well, and it
yeah,
does.
you will. So yeah, you might end up with different. That's why I say you might end up. But the tag manager is going to be adding third-party JavaScript, not first-party JavaScript, which is why you end up typically with two different sets of processes because you've got two different sets of stakeholders.
Right, and that was kind of the other question I had too, is that, or kind of point to bring up. There's nothing that says that first party code needs to be approved beforehand, right? So we could manage the first party code just as we're managing the third party, right, with a post
Yeah, totally.
approval in the exact same
Yep.
way.
You could do anything you could do pre-authorization or post-authorization or a mixture.
And I think another point here to bring up too, and a question we get from merchants, is around the guidance column. And I only bring it up here because you kind of slightly mentioned it there, John. The guidance column is just that. I don't know, John, Gareth, if you guys want to expand on that idea. Some people take the guidance to be, hey, these are things that I need to do.
No,
Definitely not.
Shall I use the? I'll use the. There is a page in the standard that explains it. It's right at the beginning. When we write security standards, we have two things that you have to do, which we call normative, and things that are hopefully helping you work out what you have to do, which are informative. The first two columns in the standard, the testing, the requirement, the defined requirement, and the customized approach objective, and the applicability notes, they're normative. That's the standard. That's what you have to do. The testing procedures, what the assessor has to do, is normative. The guidance column is just that. It's informative. It's guidance. It's designed to help you understand why the standard is there, why the requirement is there. And in version 4, we spent an awful long time rewriting all of the guidance. So it's all nice, got nice subheadings in that hopefully explains why the requirement's there, why we're asking you, well, sorry, I'm not we anymore. Why the PCI DSS or the card brands are asking you to do this requirement? So hopefully it explains it and gives some examples of good practice and things you can do. But they are examples and they are good practice. They are not the requirements.
Great. Anything else here?
One final thing.
Go for
I just wanted to add one quick thing to this one as well. The first bullet there talking about existing policies, procedures, or processes. If you have a process that exists already, as John talked about, it makes so much sense to use what you already have. People are following those policies, following those procedures. And if this can be tied in, weaved in with what you already have, it makes that BAU process much, much easier. So, John and I were both QSAs in past lives. And for me, one of the biggest issues with going back to do a second assessment or a follow-up assessment was seeing which policies and procedures have been forgotten about. If you can get these into the everyday policies and procedures that people are following versus having it in a separate document that only a few people know about and maybe they leave, they forget about them, it's so much easier if you can get everything in one place. I just wanted to mention that here.
That's great. And I think that'll tie in to the next part here, which is talking about authorizations, right? And I think the biggest thing here is, what means that you need to reauthorize, right? The standard says that you should have a method for authorizing. When do I need to, reauthorize? How often should I be authorized? What needs to be authorized? Can I do things in bulk? Can I do things, across groups at a time? John, I don't know if you want to start from there.
Yeah, the standard is deliberately vague because we didn't want to tell people how to do this, okay? This is a new class of security control, and so the standard uses the phrase a method for authorization, right? A method to make sure that everything on the payment page is authorized. And that was because, again, we saw lots of compromises where there was scripts that the compromised script that was on the payment page. No one knew why it was there or who put it there. And so the idea of having the authorization, I'm going to put it very simply, is that the entity knowingly puts that script on the website. The entity goes, yeah, I actually want that script there. So who can authorize it? I thought we'd start with who. Anyone, really. The standard doesn't say who has to authorize it. So what defines what needs to be authorized? It needs to be authorized at the script level, which is really annoying. The standard says script. So if we look at, say, Google Maps, yeah? Google Maps has more than one piece of script with it. You have to each script needs to be recognized and authorized. You could use a tool that does that says, I'm going to authorize Google Maps, and that would then say, well, Google Maps is these 4 bits of scripts. Those 4 bits of scripts are authorized. But a QSA, an assessor, and Gareth, you'll correct me if I get this wrong, I'm pretty sure an assessor will look, if they get an inventory of scripts, they'll look for an authorization for each script. So what defines a change? Firstly, a new script, right? That's the first thing. The second thing, Jeffrey, is like, well, when a script changes, does it have to be reauthorized? To which I go, well, is it the same script? In other words, if a comment's just changed, it's probably the same script, isn't it? But if the functionality of the script has changed, it isn't the same script. And so if it gets new functionality or functionality, the way I look at it is, when you authorize the script, you authorize what the script does. You authorize its functionality. So when the functionality or behavior changes, it probably would need reauthorizing. But the method you come up with is up to you. And that method also, as Gareth was talking about earlier, needs to be backed up by a policy. So you will say, we will authorize these. We will automatically by default authorize these things. We don't worry about them. We do worry about these type of things. And as you say on the slide, that's going to be very different from first party to third party, because first party, you might well know what the change is because it's gone through your CI/CD pipeline beforehand. So you'll have a ticket that says what the change was. That would be easier to authorize than actually working out what the change was when a third party does it. And actually, the biggest risk to most people's websites are changes to third party code where the third party code starts to do something else weird. I mean, talking completely outside of the PCI environment, Jeffrey, you and I are very aware, because we've been doing this for a long time, of third-party scripts that don't take personal or private data from browsers, and then a bit later down the line, say 6 months after it's been put on, all of a sudden it starts harvesting data it wasn't supposed to be harvesting.
Yeah, and I think the other kind of last note in here, or an important note to cover, might be other things to talk about, but an important note to cover would be, when talking about that authorization, right? You're more leaning into more of what the functionality, maybe behavior of that script. We get some people that kind of liken the change detection, the integrity part, take that back to file integrity monitoring, right? Which is elsewhere in the standard. That's not the case here, right? We're not talking about checking hashes, though that could be a method that you use, right? I mean, that would probably pass. Now, practically, I think there's some challenges there around making sure you have all of the JavaScript in the first place, right? The hard part with hashing, well, I guess there's a lot of hard parts to hashing, but I think kind of the first one is just making sure you have all the code in the first place, right? The third-party script, you by definition don't have it, right? It's coming from a third party, and they could be issuing a different version based on geography. It could be dynamically generated when it's requested by the client. There could be a lot of different versions of what is functionally the same script, but as far as a hash is concerned, could be very different. And so if that is an approach you use, you might be some consideration around how are you actually going to keep up with all these hashes and keep them updated, or how are you going to take code that is minified or obfuscated or otherwise not very clear what that code is actually doing? How are you going to examine its behaviors or function in the page to decide whether it should be there or not, right? We'll talk about things that you decline to authorize here a little bit later, but how are you going to make that decision if a code is minified or obfuscated, or if you just don't have it? Other notes here. Otherwise, I think, John, you've kind of hinted in.
Yeah, I mean, the important thing about not drowning in authorizations is to get the signal to noise ratio right. Right. If you get 100 script changes a day to authorize, that's not a security benefit. I mean, now we are doing compliance clicky busy work, right? What you want to authorize is the stuff that you're not sure about. So if you're in an environment like Gareth was talking about earlier, where you only have a bit of first-party script, it doesn't change very often, you're going to authorize everything because there aren't going to be many changes. You should look at them. If you've got 600 third-party tags, let's say 10% of them change every day. That's still a heck of a lot of authorizations you're going to be doing. You want to make sure you're not drowning in authorizations and actually use something with behavior that can tell you what the behavior is the script has changed.
Right, and that's the approach that we largely take here at Jscrambler with web page integrity, is around looking at the behavior, seeing what is actually occurring in the page, and then trying to decide if that poses a threat to the transaction or not, right? And so what you're designing your process around is, rather than, hey, I've got this particular script, I've got this particular hash, it's more, I have these particular behaviors, and do I see that these could pose risk to that individual transaction or to a group of transactions, and basing the authorization on that information rather than just, hey, I have a new hash.
Jeffrey, a poll has just popped up for me. Is it popped up for everyone else?
Yes, yeah. So if you would pick,
do I have to answer it
there?
now?
I think you can dismiss it since you're in the group here speaking. But for everyone else, if you'd select the answer there, we'll talk about the result from that later, I think.
Okay.
Cool. So let's jump over to 4. And I think you kind of hinted at this one, right? Who needs to authorize? Obviously, it says a method exists for something to be authorized or for a script to be authorized, but there's not really a mention of who at all.
Nope, and that was excessively deliberate. We talked up. You can imagine there was a debate about who, do we specify like the owner of the company or the owner of the web, and it was decided like, no, there needs to be a method to authorize. It could be the website, it could be any of the people you suggested, Jeffrey. It could be a manager. I think the guidance says it could be a manager. It could be an AI that authorizes it, right? It doesn't have to be a human, right? It could be anything. It could be you could have a process that said, let me invent something. If the functionality of the script does not change because we've confirmed that using a tool, then that's automatically authorized by policy, right? You just need to have a method to do it. So it could be an AI, it could be by policy, it could be by a human, it could be by many different humans, depending if it's first party or third party. It could be if you do a risk assessment of the change and it goes to the SOC, because the SOC, I mean, you can dream. Every organization is different, which is why it says a method to authorize. It does not say, it's not prescriptive. It's deliberately not prescriptive. So organizations can work out what works best for them to minimize the amount of risk that the cardholder data will be skimmed by some malicious JavaScript. So don't let people tie you up in doing ridiculously long processes for changes where someone's added a comment to a piece of JavaScript, right, to authorize that. You could have a policy that says if the only thing that's changed to the JavaScript is there's been a new comment added, then it's automatically authorized by policy.
That's absolutely right. So I think quite often with DSS requirements as well, you sort of touched on this there, John, quite a lot of the requirements will sound quite vague when you're reading them to begin with. And as John said, that is an intentional decision as the standard's being written, because there can be a whole load of different ways that you can meet the intent of that requirement. And if you look back to PCI DSS version 1.1, it would call out specific tools and even specific companies in places as to what you should be using. And over time, that has changed. It has become more vague, but it has been a a deliberate, intentional decision to allow companies to do to meet the intent of that requirement through whatever means makes sense for them, and without needing to do a compensating control as well. So yeah, that's
because
it.
the
If it
standard
meets the intent.
Yeah, because the standard applies to like a three-person company, a three-person e-com startup, the brick and mortar corner shop, what you call a mom and pop store in the States, yeah, right the way through to the biggest e-com website and a large airline which is taking millions of transactions a week. Right, you can't generalize, you can't specificize. That's not a word, I know. And the other thing is that, of course, cloud, we have no idea. People, when the standard started, it was written very much as an on-prem. As people have taken much more cloud, the standard has become more vague because, you might not have a firewall. You've got some sort of network security control, but it's probably not called a firewall anymore. So generally, the standard, as you say, has become vaguer. So you do need a method for authorizing. What that method is up to you. And remember, it does not have to be a person. Things can be low-risk. Things can be authorized by policy. Things can be authorized by an AI or a machine learning algorithm.
Yeah, and to give Jscrambler's web page integrity as an example, again, yeah, it's one that I'm very familiar with.
Okay.
We take a look at the behaviors of those scripts. So as I mentioned, right, you're using those behaviors to say, yes, this is something that I do want to authorize, or it is not. Once those behaviors are recorded, understood, as long as are authorized, as long as those behaviors don't change, web page integrity keeps authorized or reauthorizes changes to that script, leaves them in that authorized column, and only pulls them out once there's been a significant change that might increase that risk, right? And is asking someone to say, hey, come through here and take a look at these behaviors, see if they present additional risk to the session. If they do, right, that's where we might want to look at not authorizing a script. But if they don't, we reauthorize, and then again, web page integrity takes back over and continues to keep things authorized so long as they're not introducing that risk, now from that new level. And so that's an example where we have both, right? A tool that is doing some authorizations, or probably the bulk of, if you're just looking at number, and then we're asking a human in some capacity to come in and say, okay, does this affect the payment process, right? Does it pose a risk to what we have? And so you might design a very simple policy around that, right? Hey, if we take a look at a script and understand that it doesn't affect the payment process in a certain way, we understand our process. We're using an iframe, we're using other tools or products to actually do the collection of the card data. If it doesn't pose a threat, you might go through to authorize that.
One final point from an assessment perspective to highlight here too is if that authorization process is automated. So in John's example, if there's an AI that's saying this is okay, or there's something that's saying the behavior hasn't changed, that authorization would still need to be recorded. So you'd want to make sure that there's a record of that, but that could be an automated record, a log entry, whatever it is, something that you can point to say this happened because of this reason. And as long as you've got that, you're still meeting the intent of this requirements.
Great. I think that takes us over to declined authorizations, right? And I think this one's going to be kind of wide because it kind of depends on how you're approving those authorizations, right? What tools do you have available, right?
It's also because JavaScript is really terrible, isn't it? Because like somebody adds some JavaScript to your website and it runs through your instead of authorization, do I consciously want this JavaScript on my website decision? And you say, well, actually, I don't. But of course, you can't really stop it loading unless you go and take it off the website.
Oh.
I froze for some reason.
I think you're coming back.
Do you?
Well, we can still hear you.
Your audio is fine, but your video is frozen.
It is, isn't it?
A very flamboyant pose.
I know. Also with a little reaction on there that somebody thought I was doing it. That's my Mac that's done that.
I think
I suppose this shows it's live.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll give him a second to work on that. Yeah, I think from the perspective of authorizations, right? So this is Gareth. I'll let you kind of take from here. What process? What's your process for authorizing might have a lot of effect on what's your process for either removing something that's declined, right? I mean, the standard says only authorized code can be on the site. So a question we discussed a bit earlier, right? So if I don't have, or if I have code that's on the site that's not authorized, am I compliant, right?
Sure. So the short answer there is yes, bizarrely. You've identified the fact that there's some code on your site that you don't want to be there. If you're doing this in a post-authorization way, so the code has been uploaded and now a tool or your method or your the agentless scan has taken place and you've identified something that you want to get rid of, you just need to have a process to get rid of it, essentially. So have a process, follow that process. It doesn't have to be an immediate process. And one thing to highlight here in terms of the bullet points is there can be knock-on issues. So simply removing that code could have a significant impact on your website because that code could be relied upon by other pieces of JavaScript or other libraries that are on there. So you'd want to test it. You'd want to make sure that you're using the supported code or you've removed what's acting up, but make sure that everything is still working correctly. Once you've done that, you can update the website, update the JavaScript that's running on there, and all the way through that, you are remaining compliant because you've got a process and you're following that process. So there's no worry here about rushing to get things fixed as quickly as possible because, oh dear, you're not compliant. You absolutely are, as long as that process is continuing.
Right, and I think one that can you still hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so I think you're kind of having a similar issue, but I think another idea that we had talked about, right, is like even if you have an assessment ongoing, right, as long as you're in that process, as long as you're following it, you're still meeting what's being asked, right, by these requirements.
Yes, absolutely. Where you have policies, processes, and procedures, and you're following it, that's the key thing. So thinking about other PCI DSS requirements here, the ASV scan, for example, you have quarterly scans that are taking place, and you find an issue there. Provided that you're now working to remediate those issues, to identify the patches, get those applied to your systems. Throughout that process, you still remain compliant, and that's exactly the same here, exactly the same through other processes here.
Yeah, great. Let's see. Yeah, we talked about knock-on issues. Just trying to make sure I met all the points here. Yeah, rollback is more really for first-party code, right? Because obviously we really can't roll back third-party code, right? We're getting that live from where that code's being distributed. And even a lot of these, I've heard some merchants come out and say, okay, well, we're just going to, get a copy that we know is good of all the third-party script, and then we're just going to host it ourselves. And what I've seen with some is that a lot of these different third parties will actually say that you can't do that, right? They don't want you serving the code yourself because then it can't be updated, right? They rely on this update process for their own functionality, whether that's good, bad, somewhere in between. They do ask, right, that you stay on the latest version of that script, and so then your only method for mitigation might be to simply remove that script from the page while you figure out if there's other ways to limit it or mitigate the risk that it poses, or see if the business can tolerate it not being there. And
Yeah,
then
that's right. And even the licensing issue is one piece there, but even putting that to one side, you could potentially run into different security issues too, because you may be running older versions of third-party code that you're not aware of. So yeah, you may not be aware that there are security updates available for it. So if you've copied a tag manager down from one of those third parties that John mentioned earlier, and you're now hosting that locally, as those releases come out, you're not necessarily keeping up to date with it. There could be vulnerabilities that are being patched. You don't know about it, and you could fall out of compliance through other means because of that.
Yeah, and I think one thing too that has popped up just in talking to merchants is these updates, these changes are quite frequent, right? Some scripts are multiple times a week. There are situations where you have things like dynamic scripts, I kind of lightly touched on later, earlier, where we were, where the script is actually generated when it's requested, and so it can be, kind of impossible to have that correct version. If you're doing a similar process like that. I would say the last part here too is talking about, does your tooling support this, right? Any kind of tooling that you're bringing in to help you with these requirements, do they give you extra capability, right? The standard doesn't say that you need to block script. The standard doesn't say that you need to unload that script or anything of that nature. But does your tooling support some kind of mitigation or something that you can do when you decline that authorization?
That's right. It's a practical issue at this point, isn't it? If you're rolling back one library and there are those knock-on issues, then you want to still be able to get sort of secure code running. You want to get rid of whatever those issues were that you've identified, or whatever the reason is that you've declined that authorization. You want to get back to a fully authorized state as soon as you can. So making sure that your tooling allows, the first time you do a declined authorization here, you're probably going to be running around trying to figure out what's broken. So anything that can be tested beforehand is great. So look at your tooling, make sure that it does support rolling back any related software and so on, and be aware of what happens as well if third-party JavaScript changes and you're deauthorizing it. How might that impact everything that's going on the page too?
Yeah, and a rollback may not even be the only option, right?
Right.
It could be limiting the ability of scripts or limiting, reducing the ability or limiting some kind of blocking of particular scripts, whether it's individual behaviors, whether it is using CSP to prevent the loading of certain components, right? There's a lot of different ways to either remove the script or limit it, but that some of those might be intermediary steps, right? Hey, we have an ability to mitigate, but then we need to do something more permanent to actually decide, okay, is this raise an incident to say, is it misconfiguration? Is it malicious? Does it need to be pulled from the page? Those might be other considerations to make for those declined authorizations. John, welcome back. The fun of doing things live. Any other things here to add on before? Otherwise, I think we'll move kind of to one that has been a very hot topic lately, which is single page applications. And single page applications have actually, to me, have popped up a lot lately, talking about, hey, the standard says, that I really only need to look at the payment page, right? So is a single page application, is it all a payment page? Is it just certain areas? When do I need to start monitoring? What do I monitor? What needs to be in the inventory? And then from there, how can we reduce that scope?
Yeah. You can tell the standard didn't really think about this when it says payment page, can't you? I mean, being really honest, the requirement assumed there's a page where the payment's made, not that the payment could be made on any page, which is some sites, or that the payment is that we have a single page app. So let's take it back from first principles. The standard cares about what JavaScript is loaded when the payment fields are on screen. So think of it like that. So if the payment field's going to appear anywhere, which I've seen some websites in an SPA, or in the SPA there's a number of paths through, you get to a payment field, then all JavaScript in this payment page, all JavaScript in the SPA is in scope of the requirements. So they need to be in the inventory, they need to be authorized, they need to be justified. and you need to be able to assure the integrity of them. That means but it's only on the page where the fields appear. So if there's lots of other pages, you don't need to collect the inventory there. But on that page when the payment appears, you need to do all of those things. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think it's interesting too, in that what I've seen in some single page applications lately is, like you say, right, that there would be a page where people check out, right? Dealt with one just last week where the payment page can really be generated at any time, right? Or the payment fields, I guess I should say, because it's still part of the page, right? You click on a product, you're on the product page, kind of a one-click buy implementation, right? Where as soon as you click, right, you get a payment field right there. And so we haven't gone over to a kind of bespoke payment page or payment area. We're doing it right in the middle of the app, right in the middle of a product page. And so, kind of bringing all that in scope for this. And I think this kind of starts to answer a question that we had earlier, talking about, does this requirement apply to all scripts loaded from the entity's environment, or only to the scripts that are dealing with the cardholder data? Like, as you said, John, right? It's any script that's present when the payment fields are as well, right? Or payment iframes, right? But any script loaded at that time. I think another thing to emphasize, right, is that there might be multiple paths, kind of what I was describing with my example, but there might be multiple paths to actually get to a payment page. In a single page application, it might be unique, right? You might go straight through a product page to a payment page. You might go to a product page. You might go to an account page or some other area, support or contact me. You might interact with like a chat bot somewhere and then come back to the payment page. And so now you have all that script loaded too. And so it could make for a lot of different combinations of script, I guess, would be a way to think about that could be loaded at that time.
And you can't really unload script reliably or know what's not being now loaded because of JavaScript's prototype capabilities. But also there's just you can't say, just destroy that thing there. I mean, so strategies to reduce scope is, Gareth, you might have some more ideas. But, one strategy is to take payments off your single page app and put them somewhere else in a separate payment page.
Yeah, from a scoping perspective, the number of conversations again I had as a QSA where people were saying, can we just reduce this scope? Can we put this piece out of scope? And the answer essentially is, attackers don't care about scope. Attackers care about what they can attack. And so you need to consider exactly what John was saying there from a language perspective, and the prototyping features that are in JavaScript. They're very, very powerful, but it also makes attacks relatively straightforward against the language too. So it's what could an attacker do to change the payment page, to influence the payment page. If they can do something and they can influence that, it's absolutely in scope here. So yes, I think the most straightforward way, if you have a single page application, is to make it essentially a double page application, right? So have a separate page that handles just the payments. It removes all of the JavaScript that's been loaded prior to that, just focus on the JavaScript that's necessary for that payment, and then go back into the SPA straight after that. It's a much more secure way of doing it, and it'll make things much easier as well from an assessment perspective.
In fact, while we're on the subject of reducing scope, how you can not do these requirements at all? It's just redirect your customer to a PSP's hosted payment page.
Yeah. And we've seen, I guess I've seen a couple merchants take that approach. I think the friction comes in with almost the exact same friction that like you were saying, John, right? Originally these requirements were written so you just get rid of the script, but turns out the business really cares that the script is there. And so it's almost the exact same piece of friction with the business, and that if I redirect out to this PSP, to someone who's going to provide this payment page for me, I lose the user journey, I lose the metrics, I lose the remarketing, I lose all of that stuff that is the whole reason I have the script in the page in the first place. And so I think it works for sure.
But you don't lose a lot of it, right? You just lost the page. You still get the confirmation of payment. You still get the tracking. I mean, you can get an awful lot. It just requires you to do some work rather than not do some work.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, cool. I think that kind of covers it for the challenges. Gareth, John, any other notes to make around the questions we've talked about today?
Nothing from
No,
me.
I'm just checking. We just checked all the questions that were in chat, which we have.
Great.
Yeah, we had one question. I think, Jeffrey, you covered that already, didn't you? And,
Yeah.
And I want to move to, and certainly if there are other questions, please ask them. We'll get to them real quick. I know we're kind of at the top of the hour here. Want to present something that we came up with, and that's a timeline for implementing these requirements. And this goes all the way back to January of last year, or sorry, January of this year, soon to be last year, but this year. And we kind of presented a, kind of a general timeline for larger organizations, right? You see 60 days for procurement, but certainly some steps that you'll want to go through if you're going to rely on some type of technical solution for implementation. Now, this goes all the way back to January of last year, right? We're running out of time. We're getting close to that March 31st date when these requirements move from recommended to required. And so with that, want to kind of make an offer. We have a couple things that we can help you get through these stages a little quicker. Part of what we talked about is inventory, understanding what you have on the site. Where might those scripts come from? How big is the problem? How big is that inventory that you're seeking to manage? So here at Jscrambler, we've got a couple different things to help you with that, whether it is an inventory report, helping you with a proof of concept of our own web page integrity that is designed to help you to get you through most of the work for meeting these requirements, managing the script, managing headers, or even just if you have further questions around process or policy, I'm certainly willing to help with those questions or other things further. I left some time here just in case there were other questions related. I do see a question around getting access to either the slide deck or the presentation, so that will come out as an email. You'll get an email with a link to pull down a recording of the presentation. And yeah, I think that is it. We're all covered. So yeah, want to thank everybody for joining us today. Again, if there's other questions, if you come up with any later, please reach out, send us an email. We're on LinkedIn. I think you'll get a contact, a thank you message right after this that you could also reply to with those questions as well. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks very much. Bye.